Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited about being part of this conference. It's really an honor to join you at Creative Bridges 2025, a gathering that recognizes the transformative power of words in context of healing, activism, and of course, community. Today, my talk, Listening Between the Lines, will explore the relationship between poetry, deep listening, and social engagement. That is to say, empathy. I will share with you how my personal journey as a poet and cultural organizer has led me to develop ideas, develop projects that use writing as both an artistic and empathic practice. How they also improve my writing practice because they allow me to connect with my community and therefore gather angles, stories, voices that otherwise I wouldn't have in my work. I'll speak to you about three main initiatives. The first one being Red Door Magazine, Red Door Gallery, which began as an ambitious experiment in New York and has grown into a transnational grassroots platform, you could say, as well as a happy accident called the Poetic Phonothek, a living archive of global poetic voices that also curates international poetry, film festivals, panels, other types of interventions or submersive experiences. And lastly, my work as a certified listener poet with the Good Listening Project, where I engage in deep listening within healthcare contexts, offering poetic reflection as a form of empathy and recognition. And of course, along all of this, I'll talk about my personal work or the other ways I apply what lessons I have learned in my writing practice, and of course how all of this connects to my story as a human. Alongside these projects, we'll also do a short exercise in deep listening to memory and territory, as well as language, and these three key points that I always think we should focus on, and inspired by Pauline Oliveiro's practice, to experience how writing can emerge as an embodied response. But I guess we should start with the basics and get to know one another. My aim today is to show how poetry, when paired with listening, can strengthen resilience, foster empathy, and act as a cultural device for healing and social engagement. My name is Elizabeth Torres, though in my artistic practice, I'm also known as Madam Neverstop. Never stop, as if to say, hit record and just don't stop. I'm a Colombian American poet, multimedia artist, translator, and cultural organizer. That's the basic. And I'm based in the Nordic region, from where I'm speaking to you here in Copenhagen. For me, poetry began as a necessity, as a way to hold contradictions, as painful as they might have been, joy and grief, exile and belonging, silence and testimony. I was born in Bogota and later displaced into exile. I therefore learned very early that poetry is not harmless, that we as writers, when we hold poetry close, we hold a very powerful weapon. And it's always up to us who it is pointed to. At the end of the 90s, in a country devastated by war, I wrote poems about peace and resilience, what a kid would do when a kid is growing up surrounded by war. These poems won me a national award, a book award, but because of that attention, they also made me a political refugee. I was around 10 when this happened. And then I was forced to move and relocate to the US and start a new life from there. That paradox that the words of a child could be seen as dangerous through poetry, showed me that poetry carries agency, that it can deeply disturb established narratives, that it can function as what Jill Dolan might call a utopian performative. So a space where we get to glimpse new realities. Imagine to discover how powerful we are, how important our voices really are, how much they count, why we are so often silenced for that reason. Over time, I have learned or been shown that poetry is not only about healing or writing, but also about listening and speaking. Listening, as in deep, disciplined, attentive listening. And this became central to my practice for that reason. Pauline Oliveros describes deep listening as a way of expanding consciousness of sound and attention across as many dimensions as possible. And that sounds very difficult to understand, but it's actually embodiment. And this has been vital for me. Listening not to immediately reply, but to witness, to accompany, and to honor, to be present, and to give this presence as a present. I think that this resonates with broader theoretical perspectives that you might have already heard of, like Sarah Ahmed, who shows us how emotions circulate across bodies and communities, shaping forms of attachment and solidarity. Or Martha Nussbaum, who argues that literature cultivates empathy and moral imagination by letting us inhabit other lives, transporting us. Bell Hooks also speaks of this. She reminds us that love and empathy are not feelings, but ethical practices of care and justice. So how can we activate them? How can we multiply them? How can we tap into them and actively use them in our practice? These ideas guide my work, and they also underpin the projects I will share today, each of which combines writing and listening, poetry and community, empathy and cultural action. I focus a lot on the local and the global, but with a local aspect. So us as mirror of each community, and therefore the echoes that are resonating amongst us. The world threading is what I call it. I'll start by sharing what is closest, which is Red Door. I started it in 2009 as a magazine in New York, kind of like a response to everything that I was hearing during my poetic trips. From the outset, it was an ambitious experiment because at that time, digital magazines were not yet common, and we were publishing internationally without sponsorship, without any institutional backing, and operating purely on a grassroots model. The poet to the world to the poet. All of us supporting one another for the sake of doing so, of documenting our communities. Red Door has always been about amplification and connection. Over the past 15 years, it has grown into a transnational platform with correspondents in Australia, Mexico, different parts of Latin America, the US, the UK, and the Nordic region. And it continues to operate as both a digital magazine that is completely free, you can find online, and as a printed edition that is limited for collectors, for us who like to read things analog. And it's also now a space here in Copenhagen, a gallery for exhibitions, performances, and cross-disciplinary collaborations. You're always welcome to come and visit, have a show, pitch an idea, do a reading. Look it up as reddoor.dk. We have published poetry in book format, essays, visual art, interviews, festival reports, and multimedia projects also through the magazine. It's a quarterly magazine. And digitally, you can read it for free, of course. Our gallery has hosted live performances and international artist exchanges for around a decade here in Copenhagen. I think what makes Red Door unique is its independence. It's also a bit of a punishment, but it's on purpose. By refusing external sponsorship, the project remains completely free of political or economic influence. It's sustained by artists for artists, which is a form of cultural commons and definitely also a form of rebellion. We cannot be silenced because we exist for as long as we choose to. You could say that academically, Red Door reflects the power of poetry and art as grassroots movements. It exemplifies how poetry operates as a cultural mechanism, as a cultural device, not only a personal act of expression, although everything is very personal, but a collective force that archives experience, builds solidarity, and circulates empathy. It's a dream one has as a child of having a little scene in the block and then just multiplying it and expanding it so it becomes a form of communication that is loyal and legit. Through Red Door, I get to give back to the community by providing a platform, an independent, non-commercial space for experimentation, dialogue, documentation, and exchange. It's an archive, a bridge, and a laboratory, definitely. And I think it reminds me, as Ahmed Nussbaum and Hook said, in their own ways, right, that empathy and connection are not spontaneous. Hay que hacer la tarea. One needs to do the homework constantly. It's something that must be cultivated, structured, and practiced, which is why I say kind of like a punishment, as something that we need to continue renewing in compromise, in will, and in action. But then comes the happy accident. This was not in any way, I guess, intentional. A project that landed in my ears and on my head. This was during the pandemic. I'm used to performing a lot in open mics and stuff, and then the pandemic arrived and there was silence. So in 2020, I asked poets around the world to send me recordings of their voices, just so I could hear some of their thoughts, what they were going through and what they were writing. And within a month, I had received more than 100 submissions, which was also a testament to the hunger for connections through poetry, because I honestly thought I was just gonna receive a few and that's it. But the poems never stopped arriving. It was like a rain, and since then the Phonetic has developed into a registered nonprofit in the US and in Canada as well, and it has bases or headquarters in the Nordic region and in the UK. Its purpose, now defined, is to preserve and amplify living voices, particularly those of experimental and underrepresented poets, documenting their languages, their dreams, their fears, their memories, their experiences. My dream is to have this cataloged through precisely these, not just languages and regions, but the things that we've been going through as a species, how our communities interact, right? The archive collects voices in many ways. It does it through traveling telephones placed in museums, festivals, and schools. And this is an actual telephone you pick up and record your poetry through. And this is done through poet ambassadors who represent the poetic phonotheque and curate the submissions. They travel with the phones to these different venues and then curate the submissions from there. And then through exhibitions that circulate internationally. What's important, I think, is to note that the phonotheque also organizes locally and globally. So we do 2 annual international poetry film festivals, also screened digitally and locally on site in Canada and in Denmark, and sometimes in Sweden as well. Films, documentaries, animation, experimental works in Calgary and Copenhagen are the basis for the collection and organization, but from all over the world. And then these collections tour to smaller venues globally, and whatever is poetry films only becomes part of the permanent archive. And this allows us to see poetry in a capacity much greater than just writing. It inhabits media, and then it reaches very diverse audiences. From a theoretical standpoint, the phonotheque is, I think, an example of what performance theorists call a living archive, because it's not static at all. It's definitely performative and constantly renewed or growing. It's receiving contributions of poets worldwide, and listening to these voices enacts what Oliveros describes as deep listening, definitely, but also what Ahmed frames as the circulation of affect. It's a very touching experience because you realize that you're not alone. It's the expansion of moral imagination. When you feel that connection that is so deep, you stop being an individual. Each recording becomes an entry point into another world. Each voice is an act of agency and resistance. And this documentation, I think it's so important because it allows us to tap into something greater than ourselves, a well of us as we exist right now. Imagine the power of poetry if we can do that. For me personally, the phonotheque has reinforced that my writing is definitely strengthened by listening. How does poetry sound? What does it have to say? It has shown me that even in isolation, listening can generate collective resonance, transforming personal need into global collaboration. It was just a call that was made, and look how many answered, and look how it keeps growing, and look how much more there is to give. How when I felt completely alone, it was poetry that reached out and said, come, we're a very strong community and we're everywhere. Because of that reaching out, I want to talk to you about the Good Listening Project. And I know this is very quick information, but these are projects that are deep to my heart, so I speak passionately about them. And this third project that I want to share with you today is called the Good Listening Project. It's a US-based nonprofit that works within the field of healthcare specifically. And I am a certified listener poet. I actually went through an extensive training for this, but this means my role is to create listening space, or to hold listening space for doctors, nurses, end-of-life patients, and sometimes family members, and people in healthcare settings. It's a very, very special and enriching practice. This begins pretty much with a conversation, but it's not casual. It's structured around deep listening as well. without judgment or specific agenda. From what I receive or from what I hear, I compose a poem that reflects back their words, their grief, their sorrow, their fear, honoring their story in distilled form. It's a response mechanism that is not automatic. It's very being present and channeling and serving as empathic mirrors, you could say, validating the speaker's experience while allowing them to see themselves anew through our words. Yeah, through our interpretation of their words. In high-pressure healthcare environments where burnout and invisibility are common or repetitive and super dangerous as well, attentive listening itself becomes a form of care, super important and not common. The poem in this case is both a gift and testimony, a reminder that their voice has been heard, that they matter, that they count, that someone heard them, witnessed them, documented them. This practice also embodies Olivero's deep listening that I talked to you about before, and that notion of affect circulating across communities. The act of connecting with empathy as a writing practice and viewing literature as cultivating moral imagination. It enacts Hooke's insistence that love and empathy must be practices, not abstraction. So in this case, you force yourself to be present through the story of the person sharing you their struggle, and rather than constantly interrupting, to really deeply connect. And for me, this definitely sharpens my writing. It reminds me that poetry's power is not just on the page or the stage, but also in its capacity to witness, to dignify, and to humanize. It returns that power to me. It's not AI, it's really the heart that is writing. And then I also do this away from the healthcare practice, but definitely continuing that empathic role in another more performative level by offering poetic consultations. This is more as part of my artistic practice. These are longer, more intimate, you could say, intimate sessions, usually lasting 20 and 30 minutes, where I engage in a performative practice of deep listening, kind of like offering an oracle, a session like you see palm readers or something. It's kind of that style, but it's not divination. It's me, my typewriter, and a guest who dares to face that poetic oracle. So the setting is often a museum, a festival, or an artistic residency of some sort of like cultural environment that allows for an individual setting, or like a private, semi-private setting, where participants are invited to sit with me and share what is on their mind or heart, like a fear, a secret, a desire, whatever is heavy in their hearts or present in them. I listen fully, without interruption or judgment, and from that deep listening, I create a poem that reflects back what has been shared. I've never experienced something so powerful. Each consultation is unique. It's part conversation, part performance, part act of co-creation, of course, and it's definitely ritual, absolutely unique every time, so intimate, and it's so life-changing also. The poem becomes a mirror, a keepsake, a physical object of art a way of seeing their own story through a new lens, and the truth that only they recognize. For me, it's another way to affirm that poetry is not only text, but also performance, that we're not stuck to just writing, but existing as poets. It's an encounter, a shared space of presence, attention, and transformation. So with all of these projects in mind, I would like for us to try something together that is focused on this deep listening as well. I'm going to walk you through a brief exercise inspired by Pauline Oliveros' deep listening, but also resonant with thinkers that have influenced me a lot, like Fritjof Capra, who emphasized the interconnectedness of all systems, our belonging. So you're very welcome to close your eyes or soften your gaze. It'll be a writing exercise also, so have paper and pen ready. Listen not only with your ears, but with your whole body. Imagine listening to memory, to territory, to ancestry. I will say 10 words. Each connects to themes of territory, memory, language, and agency, which are the themes I explore in my own writing. And as you hear them, you can just allow associations to emerge. You're welcome to write them down or simply to feel them as images and impressions. The 10 words are: dialect, border, archive, pulse, territory, echo, migration, tongue, home, cartography. What emerges when you hear them? Which memories surface? Which geographies? Which languages? Writing here becomes a form of listening, of memory, reflecting what arises from within as much as from without. What was missing in those words? What hurts? What comes alive? What brings us back? Poetry and listening are not merely artistic practices. They're ethical, cultural, and most definitely political practices. Through Rhetor and the Poetic Phonothèque and the Good Listening Project, I'm seeking to show that poetry can archive, connect, resist, and heal. Writing, when paired with deep listening, becomes more than expression. It becomes a cultural thread, a device capable of fostering empathy and building bridges, just like we're doing right now. Thank you so much for your time. And remember, the product is the process, and the process is the product.